Hi, everyone. It is wonderful to be back with you. Thanks for those who joined us back in our symposium back in 2021. It's been a few years since then, and certainly the world has changed a lot. But we're very glad to have you with us tonight. As Larry said, I am Kelly Kuo. I am the Associate Artistic Director of American Lyric Theater. And today's session is Pathways to Opera for Composers. Before we start, I'd like to take a moment to thank some of our sponsors, the National Endowment for the Arts, the New York State Council on the Arts, the Mellon Foundation, the Dubose and Dorothy Heyward Memorial Trust, the Howard Gilman Foundation, the Amphion Foundation, the Aaron Copland Fund for Music, and the Ditson Foundation for their support of our free programs to provide resources for opera composers, librettists, and dramaturgs. We're also very grateful for all of the individual donors who have made or continue to make a personal investment in our programs. We can't do anything without your support, of course. So now we turn our discussion this evening to four fantastic composers. Before I introduce our panelists, I want to acknowledge that part of the purpose of this particular session is to encourage applications for American Lyric Theater's Composer Librettist Development Program. And so we'll be talking a little bit about the CLDP tonight, but our discussion is really meant to focus on encouraging artists from a wide variety of backgrounds to tell their stories through opera. And so with that in mind, we've invited four really wonderful artists to join us and talk about their very different journeys to the opera stage. I'll introduce each one briefly, and then we'll dive into our discussion. We do have a Q&A set up, so if you have any questions, please feel free to type them in the chat, the Q&A, not the chat. We will be monitoring them more easily in the Q&A, so please put them there. We'll likely answer most of the questions or address most of the questions at the end of our session, and it's just easier for us to find that way. So with that in mind, let's get started. We have our first panelist, Anthony Davis. Anthony, can you turn your camera on, please? Currently Distinguished Professor of Music at the University of California, San Diego. Professor Davis has written 8 operas so far in his 4 decades plus as a composer, including 2020 Pulitzer Prize for the Central Park Five, and the recent very successful production of X, The Life and Times of Malcolm X at the Metropolitan Opera, also recently inducted into the Opera Hall of Fame. Welcome, Anthony.
Thank you. Thank you.
Next, we have Kamala Sankaram. We have a very distinguished PhD from the New School and currently member of the composition faculty at the Mannes College of Music and SUNY Purchase. She's written 12 operas, am I correct there? Something like that, including Monkey and Francine and the City of Tigers, commissioned by Houston Grand Opera and developed in partnership with American Lyric Theater. Her recent commissions include works for the Glimmerglass Festival, where she was the 2022 composer in residence, and also Washington National Opera and the Prototype Festival. Welcome, Kamala. We also have Jeanine Tesori. Jeanine, could you please turn your camera on? A writer of 5 Tony-nominated scores for Broadway, including The Early Modern Millie, Caroline or Change, and also won Best Original Score in 2015 for Fun Home. Her opera commissions include the Metropolitan Opera and the Glimmerglass Opera, and her very, very poignant and powerful opera, Blue, has been making the rounds throughout the country and abroad. Currently serves on the Council of the Dramatists Guild and teaches musical theater composition for Yale University. Is that still the case?
Yes.
Excellent.
I mean, as of today, so let's see.
Wonderful. And finally, flying in just in the nick of time, we have Christopher Cerrone. Christopher, are you there to turn on your camera yet?
Thankfully, I am.
Wonderful. Grammy-nominated composer and had his opera In a Grove named as actually one of the best recordings of 2023 by the New York Times, winner of the 2015-16 Samuel Barber Rome Prize in Musical Composition. Christopher is also a CLDP alum And recent projects include symphonic works for the Louisville Orchestra, a brass concerto for the Cincinnati Symphony, a violin concerto for Jennifer Coe and the Detroit Symphony, and has upcoming large work commissions for the LA Phil and Roomful of Teeth. And like the rest is also on a faculty, and Christopher serves at the Mannes School of Music. So we have a great panel here of composers, and I'd love to start by having each of you describe what you were doing immediately before writing your first opera. What were your creative energies and focused? Jeanine, why don't we start with you?
Ooh, where was I focused? Well, I when I started working with Tony Kushner, and we were developing Carolina Change for the public when George C. Wolfe was the artistic producer and the director of it, that was really the shift for me. Opera is a term that I've had to figure out what it means for me, and that continues. You know, I finished the commission for the Met last night, the orchestration, and I thought, you know, labels are an interesting thing. They work so often ex post facto, so I do love the idea of the opera as a work, the literal meaning of it. But Carolina Change for me was how I hear the world, and whether it's in an opera house or in a theater, my work tends to be, I prefer it to be through sung. I'm not exactly sure why that is. It's just sort of how I hear everything. The book musicals don't come naturally to me, but I also love them and loved writing them. I learned a lot from Fun Home and also from David Lindsay Bear, who is the head of playwriting at Juilliard and wrote Kimberly Akimbo, which we just is on Broadway now. And so it's all of the learning coming to fruition. The opera allows me, as a composer, to use the entire palette, and not hold back. And that for me is great freedom. It's really liberating.
Wonderful. Anthony, what was your path?
Well, just prior to, I thought about doing opera when I was in high school, but I wasn't ready to write one. I had a whole concept of what opera would be. But I think immediately before I did X, I was writing a lot of music for dance. And I wrote a piece for Melissa Fenley called Hemispheres for the BAM, for the Next Wave Festival. And I wrote a piece for Laura Dean, and so I was very excited about movement and music, creating movement and music, and I found that was very useful because in moving to opera, people don't realize that it's about people moving on stage too. It's about generating, also having the momentum, the musical momentum in it. And so going into opera, a lot of my ideas working with music for dance were incorporated into X. And, you know, particularly my rhythmic structures, the rhythmic structures I was sort of obsessed with, you know, so it kind of had a rhythmic structure in X that came directly out of that collaborations I did with choreographers. And it's ironic. I worked with Rhoda Levine on X, and she started as a choreographer before she was a director. And so that was a great part. Her working with her was a great part of my learning process too, in developing X. We had a couple of workshops, et cetera, and that really developed the idea. But I think a lot of my ideas for operas, particularly the kind of idiom I wanted to create, the idea of merging both music of the African diaspora with the European, I thought was something that I began to think about when I was living in Italy in 10th grade. And that's when I really started to come together some of my ideas about what I thought opera could be.
Wonderful. And Kamala, what inspired you right before you were starting to write your first opera?
Well, I started my career as a singer. So the part of what led me to making an opera was that I had just spent 2 years touring with the Worcester group doing a piece called La Didone, which was a mashup of a Cavalli, Dido, and Aeneas with a Mario Bava space zombie movie called Terrore nel Spazio, which is people in fabulous silver cat suits getting possessed by space demons. So it kind of opened up. I mean, I was a new music singer primarily. That's what I did. So my career was doing things with like the Philip Glass Ensemble and with Eighth Blackbird and with composers who were really focused on how to use the voice as an instrument as well as storytelling. So to see the two things coming together in that piece, it kind of made me want to return to composing because I had kind of moved away from it and focused more on my singing career and also my doctorate, which was in psycholinguistics and in pragmatic uses of language. So I think that those two things together, thinking about how you can create a musical semiotics and thinking about how the voice can be the different colors of the voice inhabit that musical semiotics and can enhance the storytelling. And then also as a high soprano wanting to make pieces for myself where I wouldn't die, that all kind of informed coming to opera as a writer, not just as a performer.
Wonderful. And Christopher.
Yeah, it's funny. I guess I was in grad school when I started writing my first opera, and everyone told me not to do it because they're like, oh, you're too young to write an opera. You need to write some other pieces, develop your style. But, I've been really fixated on a number of things that in retrospect made a lot of sense. I had adapted a number of other Calvino books, Italo Calvino books. And so I began working on this adaptation of Invisible Cities by where I did the libretto and also the music, and it was very much a kind of figuring it out as I go kind of scenario. And so, I think I found myself not even really, I mean, I loved the voice, I loved words, and I loved the mixture of the visual and the dramatic and the, sonic. And so, yeah, and that first opera, it was really kind of, I guess you could call it an experimental opera, though I don't really like the term. And I think that it's funny because I wound up writing that, and we workshopped it a bit at Yale, where I met Jeanine and mentored with her, like, God, so long ago now. And then only after that did I come to the CLDP, because I think, Invisible Cities wound up being done by the Industry in LA, which is an experimental opera company and a very unconventional production. And then sort of when I went to CLDP and subsequently within a Grove, I began thinking about how perhaps I could write an opera that could be performed inside an opera house. So
Wonderful. Well, some of you have touched on this already. I would love to ask all of you, how is writing an opera different than other forms of composition? Are there any specifically unique challenges, and how have you specifically addressed those in your own work? Let's change up the order a little bit. Anthony, why don't we start with you?
Okay, I think one of the things is you're dealing with long forms, and long forms, so that there's a certain sense with an opera that it refers to itself. Has to have it's its own like living body. It's its own thing. You're creating your own kind of world with each piece. And so I sort of think about that. I mean, I think that applies to other forms of composition as well. But for me, it's that finding the something, that through line, that's something that connects everything, that makes sense, that helps tell the story, but also brings in the backstory, the underlying story, so things in it. And what's one thing I love about opera is that and sometimes I think of arias are the backstory, that you would never do in theater. You never do in a play. If you wrote a play with people saying what they would say in an aria, they would think you were nuts. But the idea that the revealing stuff, what's behind things, and that can be also, that can be psychological, but also political, and that's where, and I think the thing that drew me to opera too was that it allowed me to express because I was very interested in politics growing up. And so there's something the political realm is something I always wanted to engage in, but through opera, I found a way to do that through music and engaging with political topics, with things that are at the crux of what I think is the kind of crossroads of American culture and American politics, and finding the nexus of those two.
Actually, you said you were writing dance immediately before you started writing X. Do you consider writing for dance also a long form, or is that a different kind?
Yeah, I mean, it was. I think that was more of almost a suite form. I mean, I was kind of influenced a lot by opera, but also by, I love Duke Ellington, and I love, Charles Mingus, and that's been a big impact to me. So, Ellington, of course, the suites he wrote, et cetera. I studied them pretty thoroughly. So I was interested in that, and I think working with that, and then I see the other factor before I wrote opera was working also with poets. I did a lot of performances. I did at the Public Theater. They had this whole thing of choreo poems. Were called choreo poems. I worked with Edazaki Shange and with my cousin Talani and Jessica Hagedorn, a number of great poets, and we did a theatrical production with music and poetry, and that was so interesting because they're also engaging with words, creating music behind the words, and then and we had a fantastic band with David Murray and Michael Gregory Jackson and Fred Hopkins and Verona Clough, and so it was also incorporating improvisation in it as well. So that was a really dynamic thing, and I think the idea of working with words, and it wasn't that far for me to go from creating musical backgrounds to poet to setting the words themselves, and so that was a real big factor for me.
Now, Kamala, you of course were working with words as a singer quite a bit, and how was writing opera for you different than the stuff that you were composing right before?
But I think one of the reasons that I have tended to focus on opera and theater more so than chamber music, concert music of different kinds, is that I'm really interested in collaboration. And I'm interested in making things that I couldn't make by myself. This is also why I have gravitated more towards working with different librettists. Although my first opera, I also wrote the libretto myself, which I don't know if it was as successful as Chris's, but that happened. But I think what's really wonderful about opera is that you have so many different potential collaborators to work with. So it could be a choreographer, it could be a projection designer, and costumers and makeup artists, and of course the singers who are, they're also a really important part of the collaborative process, and thinking about how you can create character through the use of music, but also through the use of their voices, and how you choose to take advantage of all of the different colors that are possible in that kind of a voice, and like whether or not you decide to amplify it, and whether or not you ask for extended technique, or whether you just allow us a beautiful bel canto line. There's so much possibility there just within the human voice. And I guess the other thing that really draws me to opera and to other forms of theater, of course, as this idea of music as character, and music as sort of a psychological counterpoint, which one of the things that you can do in opera that you can't do easily in a play is you can have multiple perspectives that are shown through who is singing at the same time, and also what the music is saying about what they think. Whereas if you have a play where everybody's talking at once, you get a sense of like general feeling, but you can't hone in on the individual characters the way that I think that you can in an opera or a musical. So it's just very exciting because you have these layers of complexity that are really possible and fun to explore. And I think that with contemporary opera, the fact that we are diving more into the theatricality of it, it's just a really exciting time to be making things, I think.
Right. And so not one area has to do all the heavy lifting, right?
Exactly.
So you have so
Yeah.
many
And I
many
would also
things.
say that, because of the way that contemporary opera allows such flexibility in what is an opera and what can be an opera, I've had the ability to collaborate with people who are not even in music. Like I made a 10-hour-long opera for the trees of Prospect Park that was done in collaboration with arborists, including Dr. Suzanne Simard, who is awesome. If you haven't read her book, Finding Mother Tree, I highly recommend it. I worked with privacy researchers at Carnegie Mellon to make a privacy opera. And so, just the potential for what it can be, I think is really, really exciting, and bringing in people outside of what we would consider to be opera, just to push and expand the form.
Wonderful. Christopher, I listed off a number of symphonic compositions that you have written and have coming up. Is that how is that different from opera for you, if at all? And what are the unique challenges?
Yeah, I in fact just landed from a flight from Phoenix, where I had a kind of premiere with the Phoenix Symphony there. So, I think for me, it is kind of, I think a few other people hinted at this already, that it is this idea of music as a storytelling device. And so I don't actually think it's different. And that piece was kind of adapted from a ballet, so even more storytelling. But I think the thing with opera is actually that, how do you create a musical form that is there to advance the story, in some way or another? And this is why, people say, like, what makes an opera? I'm like, well, it's quite elusive, but I think the most important thing in the adaptation process is that the music should advance the story in some way. Should actually, I think a bad version of opera is a slowed down play. And a good version of opera is a place where music can add to the storytelling process and enhance both emotionally and dramatically what's going to happen. So, for example, within a grove, since it's based on the famous story by Akutagawa, in a grove of the same name, the same events take place 3 times. And so I used musical repetition in order to advance, sort of help the listener understand exactly what's happening dramatically, because the same beats happen over and over again. So I think the biggest challenge is that it's that music and story just have to be completely in sync with one another. And that's obviously, always challenging, but very rewarding when it happens.
Wonderful. Now, Jeanine, you had quite a bit of history of large-scale works that involve both voice and orchestra and spoken dialogue as well, prior to coming into the world of opera. What is different and unique about what we call opera in this day and age?
Oh, I mean, like Kamala said, I'm not exactly sure. I think sometimes I try to answer things to feel smart, and I don't feel smart about it. I feel curious about it. I really, I get asked this question of what the difference is between musicals and opera, and I was like, hell if I know. I really can't say it. I can only feel it. I think there are certain things about music that I can't verbalize, like drama. I can't verbalize. I've studied storytelling my whole life. I think the Sicilian culture is a really interesting one for story. I mean, they almost always end with someone dying or going blind, especially if you're a woman, is like everything. I once asked a guide, we were climbing, and I was like, is there no folktale in Sicily doesn't end with death or blindness? And he's like, no. And I thought, well, okay. But, I think the idea is the epic nature and the space that it takes up. So Kimberly Akimbo, not an opera. Blue, an opera. To me, it's the epic story of Tazewell Thompson's life, and the epic way that how he has always felt. For me, illuminating that story of the somewhat declared fate, the Greek fate, of how he has felt as a Black man in America, that something had been decided for him already, that there was not a free will. So it took on this huge nature, but it's not populated by a lot of people on the opera stage. But to me, it met the proscenium. It could not really be, for me, contained. And so it's just a sort of vibe and a feeling about that. I think no matter what, I grew up playing pop and classical music side by side with world music because I was studying it with my teacher, this amazing teacher from a really young age. And then I left classical music because I couldn't find my way in at all. I was only studying male composers. And I sort of, my rebellion was to leave music, which was so silly. And I wish someone had stopped me. But when I found my way back in, it was through the theatrical forms, through Entezake Shange and through seeing Linda Twine conduct and through like seeing all these astonishing musicals that had started, especially the ones downtown that were busting form without declaring they were busting form. They sort of just did it. And so that's really my study as composer, as dramatist. And the way that Anthony was saying, the way that music and language work in a sense that it's a transformative art. And it happens through ritornello, but it also happens through the idea that we have a collective memory. At 8 o'clock, you start something, and at 10:30, or for me, later than that, if you haven't cut it enough, you all have the same memory coming out with the same reprises. And so I find that really endlessly oceanic about what is possible in terms of storytelling.
I'm curious, Jeanine, do you think of, talking about forms, do you think of song form any differently between opera and musical theater, or at all?
Yes, and I think it's also I've like Kamala was saying, I've written 4 operas with 4 different librettists because I feel like the tennis game is really interesting and it asks different things of me. And I think song form, the Broadway audience is simply different. They're just different. I've done 15 shows, each one, and including plays like, the 12th Night Experience, Free Man of Color with John Guare. Every single one is so different, but a Broadway audience, when they go past over the threshold of a Broadway space, there's an expectation. It just is there. And I think the threshold is really interesting. When I write for an opera, first of all, I don't write for amplification. Grounded has electronics in it, but it is about technology. It's not about amplification. It's really about the technology of drone warfare and what happens when you take the voice and you process it. But there's the ideas of rhyme for me in opera are very, very different. I work with only perfect rhyme theatrically. I think that, it's the Sondheim, the way that the rhyme absolutely tightens the ear and the expectation that there's a tension involved that's relieved with a perfect rhyme. I don't feel that way in opera. The idea of song form for me is much freer, but the idea of dramatic action, activation, transformation is absolutely the same.
All right, so interesting. So I know we have a few questions that have been popped into the Q&A. Just want to let you know, you can continue putting those in. We are monitoring those and we will address those as best we can at the end of this session. So Christopher, what is the most exciting thing for you about being an opera composer? Is it any different being at the premiere of an opera than the premiere of a symphonic piece or another piece that you've composed?
Oh yeah, totally. I mean, I think that of all things, there's a kind of miracle aspect of operas when they work because they take so long to happen. Each one feels like it takes almost 10 years. And then I think there's just so many things. Well, because I feel like with an orchestra piece, you're sort of in and out in a week. It's from like nothing to done, whereas an opera is a long process. And so there tends to be a lot more emotional intimacy in the collaboration between the singers. And I think the idea of just like that it would work so differently every time. I think an opera, just because of staging, because of different singers, I mean, the personalities are so distinct. So I don't know how to put it, but I think maybe perhaps for me, what's most interesting about it is it involves maybe a little bit less of you as a composer, or rather that you and your collaborators, because my first opera, as I said, was written without librettist, but my second one was written with Stephanie Fleischman, who I met through, she wasn't in my year, but she also did the CLDP program. And I think that process, and with our collaborator, Mary Birnbaum, the director, and everyone else on the team, it sort of feels like it becomes bigger than you. And there's something quite remarkable in that, and that there's a kind of collaborative generosity that has to happen in this space for the work to work. If it's only about you, or if it's only about the words, or it's only about the direction, then there's going to be inherently something deeply disappointing in it dramatically. So I do think that there is this moment of the singers, the design team all have to magically sync up. And I can't imagine anything else. Maybe a movie would be the only other thing I could think of with this sort of equivalent. But, just the whole thing becomes bigger than you. And if it works miraculously, it's because of more than you. And I think or you have to write something that can be more than you. I don't know how to describe it, but that's definitely what is special about making an opera, and why I think probably all of us do this.
Absolutely. Anthony, do you get any particular excitement when you get asked to write another opera that's different than getting a commission to write a different piece?
Or yes, because operas are funny because as again, the length of the process, sometimes you generate the idea, you have an idea that you want to do, and you're looking for the right people to work with and also so that you can really collaborate. And I find that really intoxicating. I mean, that the idea of the collaboration. Sometimes the ideas come to you. Someone says, "Oh, would you be interested in doing this?" When I did Central Park 5, I was actually thinking about doing something else for that, and the producers sent me the libretto, a draft of Central Park 5, asking me if I could recommend someone to write the music. And I said, well, I read it, I said, yeah, I'd like to do it. But that's so it's funny how that happens. And I think, but it's something I've loved the collaborative process also working with my cousin. I work with my cousin on 2 operas, on X and Amistad, and we have other projects we want to do in the future, but we have such a long standing collaboration, that goes well back before that, even when we were little kids, so that's really part of it. And then so it's always exciting for me to have a new project. Also, working with different people too. I've worked with different librettists and very, very different, working with poets, working with playwrights, working with, people who come from different modes of writing. And I find that very interesting because, how a poet approaches a libretto is very different from how a playwright approaches a libretto. And it's very interesting. So also my role in dealing with the words and what needs to be done to make it into a piece changes with that kind of relationship, whether and that's been fascinating for me.
Jeanine, opera, describe what you feel differently about getting to write one as opposed to a musical theater piece. Is there a different feeling in general connected?
Yes, dread. I mean, I think we all share, what we do is, I feel like, and I wonder how everyone else feels, it's supremely lonely. I mean, we sign up for it. Anytime a student or someone will say, I want to go into long form composition, whatever it is, and Anthony calls it long form composition, that's because you're creating a world over 2 hours. Or whatever it is, where it's a Ziploc world. You're creating everything. You're creating the tone and the way it moves and it smells and breathes. And that takes years of your life and your experience. Who came before you? It just is everything. You go to the edge with it. And my dread really comes from not being alone. I mean, I lived in a lighthouse for a year, so I'm primed for it. But really, will I be able to take this on and really get what I imagine in my head? Will it give me that feeling of what I would like it to do? But it is 8 years of your life. Every long form composition that I've done that I feel like really is a serious piece has taken 7 or 8 years. It's almost like grad school and then finishing school. because and as Christopher was saying, you're working, it's not just about you, it's about a lot of people bringing their lived experience, and you're in a big poker game and they're putting stuff into the middle of the table. It's not just you, but at the end of the day, the authors, that's where we own it for a reason. It's because it's generative, everybody else is interpretive. So we're doing it from the toenails up. And for me, it just takes time, because you need to go away from it and go to it. And because the opera, you do your own orchestration, and for musicals, I don't, there's not enough time. It means there's a whole next layer of composition that comes in when I get to the really big vertical pad.
Can I bounce off of that just really quickly? When you're composing an opera, do you think of orchestration as, do you think of orchestration at all when you are actually in the middle of composing it?
Yeah, I feel like, I don't know if it's Christopher that said, the orchestra is a character. And I think because I was a side band for so long, I started at 19, so I know what it's like to be in a pit. And so I want to know from that point of view, they're going to have to change reeds. They're going to be like, well, they have time to do their mute. Oh, they're out a lot. Oh, their axe will be really cold. Oh, they're like, why is everybody, that's a community underneath. Like the opera orchestra to me is so astonishing. When they played X, it was like, holy moly, because you could tell they were so in it. And you could flip that stage. The opera singers could have been down here. Those incredible costumes, but I feel like the orchestra is a giant character. They're omniscient. And so, as you can tell, I'm so passionate about that, because I know what it's like to accompany, and the accompaniment should live independently from what's happening for me up on the stage.
Great. Hopefully that hits is very profound to some people who are listening in. Kamala, how about you in terms of opera and the excitement that's derived from it for you?
I think the most exciting part of the process for me is always in the room, where you're discovering things together, because I feel like, and this is something I think that we could dig into more in opera from the theater, which is that your audience is your last collaborator, and you don't really know what's going to happen in that room until there are people who have not heard your piece before. But that is my favorite part, is when we are all in the room together and we're working through and we realize, oh, this actually doesn't quite work, but maybe if we just changed this line slightly, or lowered this note, or made this rhythm a little bit shorter or longer, and all of a sudden it clicks and you discover it together. And it's something that, you like in composer brain, you can be off in your studio working and you can think that you know how things are going to work out. And then in the moment you're with humans and human actors who are making their own decisions about things, then you adjust and it becomes better because everybody is contributing their full selves to the process of making it. So I actually hate opening nights of opera, because at that point it's done and I can't do anything else and I just have to sit there. So beforehand, that's my favorite part, is when we're all kind of working through the problems together.
It's so nice to be able to work with people who are alive and part of the building of this process. We in classical music often work with a lot of composers who are no longer with us and wish we could have a seance to, ask them this question. What were you thinking about this question? And why these words? So I find it equally stimulating to work with every member of the creative team in creating operas. So speaking of collaborating, the collaboration with librettists is obviously integral to the success of a work, let alone being an opera composer. And I would love to have each of you speak a little bit to how you have found it personally most effective to facilitate the collaboration with a librettist as you're developing a new work. Christopher, why don't we start with you?
Oh, this is interesting, and I feel like everyone has a really different approach. I've noticed, like, some composers are like, oh yeah, they mail me the libretto and then I make the opera. I think that's what George Benjamin said about Written on Skin, where sort of Martin Krimp mailed him the libretto. It's like, yeah, okay. But for me, I mean, I think within a Grove, we went through something like 21 drafts of it. It was really what a wild journey from first to last version. But I think for me, the most important thing really does remain this kind of formal conceit of the work. And I do think that that's something that was quite helpful that we did in CLDP, was to have a kind of a outline of the whole thing. Because then I do think you're just sort of, you and the librettist really have to be on the exact page on about what the beats are. And I remember Stephanie and I really, I think at some point mapped out every single dramatic beat of the entire opera, even though it was coming fairly straight. I mean, quite a bit changed, but it's a relatively straightforward adaptation of the story. But, you know, even then we wound up being like, this happens, then this happens. Why does this happen? Because of this. And so I think the most important thing is that the composer and librettist really be on the same page very early on about what the piece is going to be. Like, I don't think you can just sort of say, do your thing. And I think that that can also be really hard, because I think that I wouldn't want to be a librettist. I think it would be really, really difficult to take that level of input and actually make something creative about it, because they have to remain their own artist, but also at the same time, they have to be reactive to the needs of the composer. And so I think people who thrive in collaboration as well work really well in that context. And so, yeah, I think for me, and it's so funny, as we were writing in a Grove, really, like, we would have these, it was during the pandemic, and we'd have these meetings on Zoom, and it was Stephanie and I, and Mary, our director, was basically the umpire. And she'd be like, I'd be like, I have this issue with the libretto, and she'd be like, that's a valid point. And then Stephanie's like, okay. And then I'd be like, I have this issue, and she's like, fix it, deal with it, Chris. That's a good text. So I do think having another person in the room can often be very, very helpful for this two-way collaboration with two strong-willed people. And you want two strong-willed people, because if the librettist doesn't have as much of their own fortitude, then you're just going to steamroll them, and then the opera's going to suck. So yeah, I think it's a challenging process, undeniably, but I also think that certainly after looking back at my first opera, Invisible City, saying like, I really want to work with a librettist. I really want something. And now I work with writers all the time. You know, I wrote this opera with Stephanie. I'm actually writing a song right now for a group in the Netherlands with a poet friend of mine with the text. So once you get the bug of working with writers, you just kind of can't stop, because it becomes more interesting. And also you can be like, hey, can you cut those 2 words? That would be great. Thank you.
Now, Anthony, some of your librettists have been family, right?
Well, I've worked with very many different librettists, very different people, you know. I mean, from Michael John LaChiusa to Celani to, you know, I can just go down Yusef Komunyakaa, you know, and Richard Wesley. I just go down the list. And I think what's interesting is I'm a frustrated poet myself. And I think that's almost necessary as a composer to think about, like, I was always used to write. I used to write, and I always thought about writing. And I have a failed novel. I have, I do stuff like, and so I'm words are something that I'm fascinated with anyway. And I think this allows me the voyeuristic feeling of being a writer too, of working with someone else's words, and then be able to shape them a little bit. Sometimes editing. I like to think I'm a good editor, editing text to make it so it also fits in a musical moment. And then and I think that's kind of an interesting kind of way where the collaboration works. I mean, I have to say that it's no set pattern. I mean, with Michael John, I remember I was trying to talk. I wanted to do this opera. I had this idea. I wanted to do the opera about the Patty Hearst kidnapping, and I knew that I wanted to be a Black comedy. I wanted it to be funny, and I wanted it to be it's a dark, humorous story. So I interviewed different librettists to see who would be the right one to work on it. And someone came with kind of this made for TV idea for what the story would be. Oh, the poor heiress who does that. No. So then Michael John comes in. I remember going to this Mexican restaurant for lunch. He said, "Oh, when I was a kid, I used to pretend I was Patty Hearst, and they put me in a box. My friends would put me all in a box, and they shut the box, and I said, okay, this is cool. This is great." So after I got him, in 3 weeks later, I had the libretto. 3 weeks. I mean, we wrote the whole piece in 9 months. But that was insane. That was insane, and it was such risks taken, and it's a crazy piece because it has like, I'm obsessed with palindromes in music. You know, sometimes I think I have something and then I have something going backwards and something. So here in the libretto, he has these scenes that are reversed in the second act. So I reversed the music. You know, I said, okay, I'm like this Austin all I have is backwards now. And this is the backwards, and the characters are. It was fun. It was really fun because, and we did it in this furor where we actually were able to do it very fast. But you know, other things that, I mean, I think finding the story, finding the essence of the story. Also, whether you're dealing with history, which I have had done with a lot of my operas, from Amistad to X to Wakanda's Dream, you know. Tanya to a certain degree, but that's more postmodern approach to that, you know. But thinking about how you tell, you know, how you address history, what you want to tell in the story, how to retell the story, and that's been a very exciting process, you know, working with Tanya on Amistad, you know, thinking about and realizing. I mean, I just read Henry Louis Gates' book Signifying Monkey, you know. And Skip has been a close friend of mine for years, and you know, and I was thinking about the trickster at Aishu, and I said, well, I think it's the trickster story, and that's right away that puts it, boom, you know, we're outside the box. We're not doing Spielberg. that world has nothing to do with what we were going to do, and that was fun for me. That was really fun, and I think that, you know. Sometimes I look at creating opera as, you know, as being, you know, disrupting expectation, doing stuff against the grain, trying to retell history, to reform it, and to say something that people that go against, like what I would call a master narrative, and that's something that really motivates me, and I look for in librettists and in collaboration.
Wonderful. Kamala, could you speak to this topic we're talking about in collaboration with a librettist? Have you ever encountered a difficult time with working with a specific librettist, not to name any names, where
You're asking me to spill
and how
the
did you work
tea.
yourself out of it?
Oh my God. Well, I will say, I think that the only time that I really had a difficult collaboration was because we did not start by talking about how we worked, and we did not have an outline. And so I think that those are really important things to begin with, is just sit down and have a conversation and say, what kind of an artist are you? What is your process like? Do you want to be left alone, or do you want me to ask you lots of questions? Do you want me to give you a playlist? Like when I was working with David Johnston on Monkey and Francine, David wanted to know kind of what my sound world was. And so, you know, I feel very fortunate that I was able to introduce him to Mulatu Astake and Francis Bebe and R.D. Berman. And so that was the sound world of that piece. And he listened to this playlist I made him as he was writing. Some people, they want to be in their own ideas for a while before you poke at them. And some people don't want to be poked. And so it's important to find that out early on, because you know, everybody has a slightly different process and a slightly different way that they like to work. And I think, as Chris was saying, the most important thing is to make sure that you understand the story that you're both telling, so that you're actually both telling the same story. Because the music does the heavy lifting, but the libretto is the scaffold that the music has to be built on. So if you don't understand the structure of your piece in the same way that your librettist is, that's when you run into trouble. I do think that it's important to also know ahead of time what is most important and resonant to you in the story that you're telling. Like, what are the things that you feel like are really essential for you as an artist to realize how you're thinking about this story, and also to know what you can let go of. Because you are going to get into I don't want to say arguments, but I will say minor skirmishes. You're going to have disagreements, and you are going to have to let go of things, and they will also have to let go of things. And so coming into the process with just a really clear understanding of like, what is it that is essential to me, and what can I let go of, and how do I want to work, and how do they want to work? And I think that that's the most important thing.
Wonderful. Jeanine, talk about your work with opera librettists and how that might differ, if at all, in collaboration, facilitating collaboration with someone you're writing a musical with.
It's very similar in the way, I love working with playwrights. I love working with poets. I've mostly worked with playwrights. And I think one of the reasons that I love it is I've really done a lot of work. I've read hundreds and hundreds of plays, hundreds of them, and studied myths and mythology and different storytelling in different cultures. How do stories work? Now, I do not have the gift of writing a symphony. I don't have the gift. I can't write a movie score, because it's not where I'm just such a story pony. But because I have and keenly work on a composer as dramatist, that's the course that I teach, composer as dramatist. So I come to the table with an understanding for myself of story, about event, about who I feel like the protagonist, the antagonist, the rising action, the falling action, or if there's the mystery about the story that you can't see scientifically, why I want to write the story, why all of those things, like I really think about them in such a deep way, because it's helpful. Then I can speak their language, because I think a lot of librettists are snowed over by composers because we talk a different language, and we can go on and sort of leave them somewhere if we start discussing nomenclature, and that's an easy way to feel less than. And as opposed to where we come together, why we're writing it, what it evokes for us. Like the reason George Brandt wrote Grounded is very different than the reason that I wanted to musicalize it as a woman, as a parent, as an understanding of hearing so many vets and the moral injury of war and what it's like for them. An opera, it was so funny when Kamala was saying about a soprano, an opera where the woman ends up being the most sane. She breaks not into insanity, but sanity inside an insane system. I wanted to do that. And I think when the opera is your musical is always in trouble at a certain point, and to wiggle yourself out of it is a sort of scientific. For me, my dad was a doctor, and he would diagnose, and it's the same thing. It doesn't work, I think, because here, and here, it might be 30 pages before. So you come together, and it's going to look like the mama and the daddy. That's what that kid's going to look like, and the kid is your musical piece. It's going to wear both of you, and it's source material. And I think that understanding for me has allowed me to have these really fruitful, I've learned so much from these playwrights. I mean, they've just made me a better musician.
Well, like it or not, your product is absolutely a combination of all of the parts put together, right? And what each person is able to contribute somehow makes itself into the lifeblood of the piece.
Yeah. And I do want to say, when Kamala was saying, and it's something I teach, I feel like debate is so incredibly important. It's not about power, it's about the idea. And if you can verbalize your idea, you debate it. That's not a fight. That's a turning over the Rubik's Cube. What I see it this way, well, I see it this way. Well, why do you see it that way? And you lean into why you're differing, and so then it's not an arm wrestle about who's strongest or smartest. It's really about turning over those ideas that there might be a third option, which there often is, that it's neither one that you're saying, but something that's awaiting you, or one idea that's going to lead to the next. And that comes out of debate.
So there's a question from the Q&A that Anthony addressed a little bit. The question is, how do you choose your librettists? Anthony, you said you went through an interview process on at least one piece. Do you have other methods of choosing your librettist?
Well, DNA is part of it. I mean, I have to say that, no, with Talani, I mean, that was, and there's an ongoing process, we're always talking about projects we'll do in the future, or what we're going to do. Sometimes the librettist is chosen for you. I mean, when I was doing Wakanda's Dream, Levine recommended Yusef Komunyakaa as a wonderful poet, and I was very excited to enter into a completely different world with his words and his poetry. And it was sort of the opera company had the idea they wanted to do an opera about the trial of Standing Bear. And I had just done Amistad, so I wasn't that excited about doing another trial. So I said, oh, I have to figure out how to do this, so we could just do, I said, well, we can do it if we go back and forth, that it's not a linear way of telling the story, et cetera. And then it's sort of a mystery that's revealed, something that's revealed in it. So and Yusef, and I think with Conda's Dream it was really interesting. It was very intense collaboration, because a lot of stuff in their personal lives was insane. So that was part of it. But this also, I spent a lot of time on a reservation, and the Ponca reservation in northern Nebraska, and that was amazing. Went to powwows, and so I had a different insight into that, and Yusef and I both have Native American ancestry, so it was really interesting for us to explore that.
And Kamala, how do you have any specific method or behind selecting your librettist if you have that choice?
If I have the choice, then I just try to get to know somebody's work ahead of time, because the playwright's voice will shape the way that the music comes out for me. Like if somebody is has this more rhythmic kind of cadence to their language, then that's going to affect the way that I write, because I'm also supporting the words and the rhythm of the words. So I have a librettist that I've worked with quite a bit, Rob Handel, who I met through the CLDP. And Rob is really clever and very witty, and these really sharp sentences. So the things that I've worked on with Rob have been very quirky comedies, a lot of sci-fi. And so if I think about a comedy or sci-fi, then I would think of Rob. And then another librettist that I've worked with quite a bit, Jerry Dye, is magical realist, poetic, these really beautiful, almost kind of hauntingly dark plays. And so the kind of music that I would write for Jerry is supported by that. And I think that's really an overlooked step, is that a lot of composers that I know have never read a play. And so I think that's a good place to start. Go see some theater, read some plays, get to know poets, get to know who's writing and who is out there right now. I recently wrote a song for an album that Will Liverman put out, and there was a poem that I found in this book in a bookstore in Portland, and I loved this poem, and so I just Googled the poet and wrote to her and asked if I could use her poem for this song, and she said yes. And now it's a song on this album. And I think that modern writers, all of us are kind of like, you know my work, really? You read it? So I think if you just sort of expand your knowledge about who's out there, everybody loves to be told that you like their work. So I would start there, see who's out there that you resonate with, and write to them.
Mm-hmm. So Jeanine, you talked about reading lots and lots and lots of plays and you're obviously one with the theater. Now, I'm very curious as to your selection process of your librettists. When you have that choice, what do you look for first and foremost?
No, it's not one. It's not one way. It's. I think the right thing finds you at the right time. It's sort of by design. I met Tazwell, who wrote the libretto for and lived the libretto for Blue, because I saw he's a wonderful director. I saw his Appomattox at the WMNO, and I had gotten this commission, and I had asked Cesca Zambello. I just loved that production. Kenneth Kellogg, I mean, they were just unbelievable. Solomon Howard. And I said, who directed this? Because I don't ever have playbills. I don't do that anymore. I just sort of walk in. And she said Taswell. And so I asked him about, it's funny, it's like with Anthony, I met with Taswell, introduced him and asked him about who he might know. And he said, well, how about me? And I didn't know him as a writer. I knew him as a director, but he had directed it so poetically. And he's just sent me some examples of his writing. And, librettos for me, they're very tricky things, because if they exist on their own, I have nothing to add. It reminds me, when we were kids, we'd have these little sponge things and you'd add water and it'd end up being like Clifford the Big Red Dog, right? They would just like be huge because they could hold so much. And a libretto, for me, is like that. It just can't be too complete because it has to accept so much. And at the same time, have storytelling, have those edges and that softness, the contours. And so it absolutely, I think that it became very clear that I wanted to work with him right away. And I often work with, George wrote Grounded. It was a one woman show. And he wrote the libretto. So it's a lot of the times it becomes for me like that.
Mm-hmm. And Christopher, you've worked with numerous people now within the different works that you've written. What goes into your process?
Well, the only librettist I've worked with at this point is Stephanie on an opera, but I've worked with quite a few different writers who've either written me something for songs or for some kind of collaborative work. And I think that for opera especially, I think the most important thing for me as someone who exists inside and outside of the opera world is that that person does as well. They have to both have a background diverse enough in musical and different kinds of literary influences that they don't exist entirely inside the opera world, which can be sometimes a bit inward looking. And so I think that they have to have a background in some kind of experimental theater or different kinds of things. And then also simultaneously understanding experience inside the opera world, because I do think that the very specific needs of writing writing a libretto does mean you have to understand stagecraft. You have to understand, I really think that, I can't remember who it was, but someone was, I think, just someone said you always have to imagine very roughly that what is going on stage at all times. You don't have to literally be like, they'll be right there, but there has to be a sense of forward motion and forward momentum. So I think that that's, not a lot of people. And, we have a kind of soft agreement, Stephanie and I, to make another opera at some point. So I think we've all gotten along well enough that we want to do it again. But then, and other writers who just written things for me with songs, there is a delicate thing, especially with poets, saying like, oh, can you cut this? And so, and I'm working with this wonderful poet, Andres Serpa, right now, who wrote me this beautiful poem. And I really, but we had a call. He's like, well, I've never written for music before. And I said, well, these things work really well. Not too many words is most important. Often writers overwrite for when they're writing for music. And then I said, these kinds of like, repetitious imagery can often be very helpful. So I can create musical architecture within the text. And, but other than that, I kind of sent him on his merry way. And he sent me back a beautiful text. And I think having the challenge of having to approach something that was pretty different from what else I've had was part of the fun. I asked him to cut, 8 words. And other than that, I was like, it's great, wonderful, let's do it. And so I do think it's a combination of being able to, someone who can, I think trust is really important. And I also think that, especially in the context of opera, really having an understanding that you have to write words that are beautiful enough or interesting enough to inspire a composer, but also tight and structured enough that you can, advance a story, very efficiently. So it's not an easy task. I think it might be harder than writing an opera musically.
Sure.
Now, time is flying absolutely just right by, but I did want to ask Kamala and Christopher, because you're alumni of the CLDP, how, and something you spoke a little bit to it as to how CLDP helped you on your journey in terms of, meeting new collaborators, the training. Can you speak a little bit about what stuck with you the most about the CLDP training? Who wants to go first, Kamala?
You go ahead. I just talked.
Okay. Well, I think it was interesting to come in and have the opportunity to work with several different people in this sort of like I don't want to say intensive, but kind of intensive process.
No, it's intensive.
No, it is intensive. So what you learn is you learn about these, you learn how to collaborate at the same time that you're learning about the bones of opera and how opera has worked historically, and you're meeting people who've been doing it a very long time, and hearing how they think about it. And I think that is really what has stuck with me the most is that I became a better collaborator because of going through that experience and working with many different people in quick succession. And then also, I think having to write things really, really quickly, which is not my favorite thing to do, but you sort of learn what the essentials are. And then, beyond that, I am now part of a community of people who have done the program, and ALT introduced me to Houston Grand Opera, which I did Monkey and Francine there. And then I also did a short for them soon after, which that relationship was purely because of the people that I met in the program. So I think that my takeaway is the community aspect of all of it, that the more communities you can find yourself a part of and the more collaborations you can learn about and the more you can learn how to be a good colleague and a good collaborator, the more likely it is that you're going to go out into the world and continue to have that sense of community. I do think collaboration is a skill that you have to learn, and that's definitely something that we had to learn very quickly because we had to write very fast.
That's all really great. I think the thing with CLDP that was really helpful for me was, I think, one, sort of getting me to figure out a way to tie my musical preoccupations with a kind of dramatic one, and thinking always kind of about what's happening on stage at all times. And I think the other thing that was really nice was that you would, between Corey and Mark and also all the guest artists, I remember Anthony came my year, is that you'd often sort of deal with a specific musical problem. Like I can't remember, of all pieces, the dialogues of the Carmelites, the final scene in that opera where they're all executed one by one. I was like, God, this is a really awesome way to get everyone off stage. Like this is, it's a composer solving a dramatic problem where people are, being, executed one by one, but in a way that also is solved musically. And so that was, I think a lot of the times, one of the really fun things about CLDP was being like, here is a dramatic issue. How do you solve it? And we would isolate that. And I think that was really, really helpful when you've got this reservoir, or, when we were studying Otello would be another piece where I'm like, how do you deal with adapting a really serious text? And, what do they do? And they're just like, all right, start with the storm, and those things really stuck with me in terms of, when I just having this kind of repertoire of knowledge and ways to solve problems that you invariably find yourself having to solve when you're writing opera.
So all four of you are teaching, in addition to being professional writers and artists of your own. If one of your students comes to you, says, I would like to write an opera, what kind of things do you discuss? What would be one of the first things, or amongst a group of you, what's important for that student to know?
Well, one thing is that opera raises the stakes. The stakes have to be high. I mean, there has to be. I mean, and that was really funny. I had a graduate student at UCSD, right, who wrote an opera. He wrote an opera, and it was all about two graduate students deciding whether they were going to break up or not after school. I said, I mean, music, if you go, it's like a wet balloon because you can't, the music the music, because you put something in the music and it raises the stakes of the story, and then it's not satisfied. So it's not satisfied because the story can't contain the music. So I was kind of interested in that, and then I mean, talking to them also to realize to allow them to not try to, because a lot of times they try to think in terms of what's available and not what potentially they could dream to do. So they try to whittle down their vision to something that they think is sustainable, and then sometimes I think that compromise isn't what you should be doing to start out. You should be trying to really think about what impact your piece can have, what you can do, and so I found it very exciting. I take mentorship very seriously. I really enjoy working with the young composers, which I've worked with a lot of different composers at various stages, and what they're doing, both within my institution, but also it just as importantly, with ALT and other things, we're outside of the institution. I think I remember when we did one workshop with ALT with with Esperanza Spalding was in it, and Damian Jeter, and we had a wonderful group of composers that we were trying to and librettists, and they were doing little pieces together. It was very exciting to me, and I felt inspired by working with them.
Yeah, I mean, I guess my question is always why. It's my favorite letter of the alphabet. Why do you want to make it? I think the impulse for people, especially young people, I knew exactly what I wanted to do when I was 12. I just couldn't find the vessel for it, the container musically for it, because I was a pianist and my interests were so out of the box that there wasn't a box that I could see that I could fit into. But I knew that I had this thing inside that was just dying to, I don't know what it was. And I think the why of it is incredibly important. And I think the fluency of getting to know what that means. It's not just grand opera. It's like, you see what Kamala was saying about the prototype and all this new, for me, a hybridity of, I hope with grounded, a lot of theater people will come to the opera. When we did Blue, 80% of the people who were in the opera audience had never been to an opera before. That, for me, it's the exciting invitation, right? But I think there's this idea of what is your understanding of what that means, that word opera means, which means work. And why. And I think that epic nature of stakes, which is always, for me, the most important thing inside of dramatic work. If there isn't something that's pressing against a character, it's very hard to dramatize. And it doesn't even matter if it's a brochure, it's hard to dramatize if the stakes aren't high. For an opera, the stakes, for me, have to be as high as the proscenium that is housing it. And that means that you can fill the stage with ideas. It doesn't mean it has to be filled with population. And so when they were talking like that, but I think that's an incredibly important thing. To one of my mentors have always called it like curating the orchestra of the imagination. So that what you hear, because so many people, especially when they're facile with an instrument, they do what my teacher called paw playing, which is where your paws go, as opposed to where your ideas are coming from, whether it's political, historically, dramatic. And I think so my question would be like, what does that word opera ignite in you that makes you, as you said, you asked what excites you about opera? And I think that's a beautiful question to ask a student.
Anything to add, Christopher or Kamala, to your students?
It's
desire.
so funny. I was just thinking that Kamala and I teach at the same school, and I only see her on Zoom, and I hopefully will see her in person at some point, because we're always doing auditions and stuff. But I think that the question I would ask you is that any student, first of all, I would encourage them because it's fun. And actually at Manus, we have a wonderful opera program, which is very into new opera, which is great. We just did a Cell Manus opera. They just did a Kate Soper opera, and they also did a Marco Damo opera this very semester. So yay, Manus opera. And so I do say, do it, but why is this thing going to be an opera? And sometimes I get this kind of shallow response, like, oh, it would be dramatic. I'm like, well, lots of things are dramatic, but why should music enter into this equation? And how can music as a kind of, how can you make this temporal art be part of the, would it make it a better or worse story? And I think that is kind of the big challenge I always invite them to say, like, would this be better with no music? Would this be better as a movie? And really only if it would be best as an opera is when I'm interested in sort of encouraging them to move forward with it. So I think those are the big and important questions you ask them before they go. But I think that the other thing is, unfortunately, the four of us, I think, are rarities in that a lot of professors in music do not teach how to write for the voice, how to write for opera, for stage. It's changing. It's much better than it used to be. But very little of my teachers when I was studying had ever written an opera before, and so I think a lot of it is just studying them. We do rep, we do things we did in ALT because it's an underserved part of the opera training of the composition training process.
You're right, Christopher. I mean, the fact that we have four people in this room, all on faculties, who are able to speak very much intimately to the art of writing for the voice in various mediums is quite the luxury. And I think our students of tomorrow are just lucky to have that as part of their toolbox too.
Yeah, we're very lucky. We have David Little, Huang Ro, Kamala, me, formerly Missy. So we had a pretty stacked opera writing bunch, but that is the exception and not the rule.
Right. There's an interesting question here that's been posed. Before you were well known, how did you get on the radar of people who could commission you?
Am I well known? My question. This is the thing that I say to everybody is don't wait. Don't wait. Make your thing. You don't have to wait for somebody to give you permission to make your thing. That was how I started, as I had an idea for a piece I wanted to make, and I made it. And, part of that meant that I had to learn how to write grants. I had to learn how to make a budget. I had to learn about producing. But I think it's important for us to know those things anyway, so that you know what is going on in the decisions that the person who is eventually going to commission you is also making, because they have reasons behind why they ask for certain things and why they make choices about your instrumentation or your collaborators or whatever it might be. So I think the most important thing is not to wait. If you have an idea, you can make that happen. And maybe it's not going to be, the full Metropolitan Opera treatment with elephants and everything, but you can still make something. And that's how you start.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with that completely, because I had, a whole period where, I didn't have commissions. I was well known, I think, after X in some certain way, but, that was in '86, so, but I think that, but I think that you can't rely on that, and can't rely on, especially as an African-American artist, you're always in danger of being invisible. I mean, there's no question about it. So, and that can happen. And so I did start to write my own pieces, without, because I didn't want to wait. I had all these ideas, and I had I was getting my craft together, and I wanted to, expand what I did. I wanted to, do stuff with sampled electronic music, so I did, Lear on the Second Floor, which was a opera based on King Lear and Lilith, and some of my other chamber operas that was sort of written for what I could do at kind of around UCSD and around the people I had there, but also, thinking about music for opera for theater, for a black box, not necessarily opera for the opera house, and thinking of ways to also bring in different techniques like processing of the voice, etc. All those things that would necessarily be in the large scale operas I was writing. So it allowed me to experiment, allowed me to work with different kinds of structures and musical structures. But I think that's what Kamala says is great. You don't wait. do not wait. It's, I mean, you could wait for your lifetime, and then you'll never have done what you had in your mind, what you had in your head to do. So I think that and also find people that you will go to the war, go to war with you, go fight with you, go create with you. And I was fortunate to work with Alan Havis, who was a playwright here at UCSD, and so we did 2 operas together. One was based on one of his plays called Lilith, and it was fantastic because we would get together and come up with different ideas. Then we did Lear on the Second Floor. He had done a Yiddish Lear that he had done, and I had done a King Lear with Avery Brooks at Yale Rep, where I did incidental music. So both of us had done these Lears that were totally different, and then and frustrated that we couldn't do the Lear that we wanted to do. So I finally said to him, well, why don't we do a Lear? Have Lear be a woman, and she is early onset Alzheimer's, and she has 3 daughters vying for guardianship, and boom, we had this whole idea that came out, and it was a way of both of us could found rewarding, where we could go to have an adventure together.
That sounds like quite the adventure already, right there, just talking about it, Anthony. But there's an interesting question from Angelique. I'd like to toss to Jeanine. The question says, I'm curious about the relationship between composer and conductor of the opera. Do they have a say in shaping the new work, or does the conductor come in way later? Curious about your experiences in opera versus musical theater.
Oh, it's different. And I think because I was a conductor, a bad one, but because I was a dancer and then a conductor. And I think you're hearing the same themes, that a lot of us do a lot of things that spills over. So I understand time and space, and the idea of how you're trying to sculpt sound. So for me, like, Unique will be conducting Grounded. We won't have any time. I already know that. But when Steve Osgood, who just did the workshop, we will have a lot of time. And the thing about me is I have really learned notes. You'll hear a lot in the theater about notes and lobby listening. And that's when you go to the lobby and you hear someone say, I thought it was awful. And then you go to the bar, right? That's not a helpful note. I thought it was awful is not a helpful note. But when you hear something, a note, and you address the note, which comes from a conductor. I just sat with Emily D'Angelo before she went back to Berlin, and we went through every measure of the revision of Grounded, and we talked about it, and we debated certain things. And she said, look, at the end of the day, it's your piece. And I said, yes, that is true. And at the same time, I want to know what you think, because you're going to be singing it and living it and behaving it. And if you have a note that just reaches my CNN antenna, I'm gonna address it in a way. And if it's not, it will go, I've just learned certain notes go like this. They just go around you. And then there's a note that makes you angry. It's like, oh, she's right. Anzif was right. That was a sort of brutal way to overhear it, but she's absolutely right. And that for me is a conductor as well. How does it feel? How does it move in space when you have to go on? Is there something about that? Because I tend to write really angular. I have a ton of mixed meter just because I'm transcribing from my brain. And so what Steve was telling me, this feels a little bit, it's like, okay, what is it? Is it you? Is it me? Is it that thing? So I like it when they're involved really early. I work with Chris Fennick theatrically. He is always my first go-to because he knows we have a shorthand. We have a mind meld, and it's so easy for me to work with him quickly.
Do any of the rest of you have an opinion about
I have a love-hate
conductor?
relationship with conductors. I mean, sometimes it's that I want to take more musical risks with the music to really interpret it. I mean, and sometimes the people come from that kind of neo-modernist mold that they think it's like you become like if they're a metronome, and it's like, and I don't hear music like that at all. I want it to have, I mean, it's way, there's kind of romanticism about it, the sense of also feeling time as a fluid thing, not as a not as a as a locked thing, you know. So that where music should push forward and pull back, and feel that I don't feel like I should have to put it in a score, but now I do, because I found that some conductors don't do that, you know, and so I can't assume that they'll do that. They'll feel what the music does, but you know, I think, you know, that's a big part of it. And I think also I look for conductors, how they relate to singers, whether they really relate to singers or whether their heads are totally in the orchestra, you know. What they, you know, what are they, you know, what are they really, you know, honoring, you know, thinking about, you know, where they need to breathe and where the music needs to breathe. You know, that's so important. I mean, it's like making it a living thing and not this mechanical thing,
Right.
and that not this big machine, you know. And so that's the thing that I look for, and that, and you know, I'm working with conductors is very interesting. And for me, I mean, it's something I would never want to do.
That is right. But I'll tell you, so much of the key is, I mean, Jeanine is so brilliant at balancing that Met Orchestra. I mean, you go to that rehearsal, they're magic.
Oh,
They're magic. And it's like they find pockets, because I agree with you, Anthony. You don't want, like, I trained in Nashville, and they know a pocket in Nashville's way at the back of the beat. And, you know, when you hear the Met and many beautiful orchestras, I know the Met Orchestra better, they know how to balance and accompany and hold their own. He balances that orchestra within an inch. It is a tremendous, tremendous talent.
no, that's a really fun part. I mean, also that for me, I mean, it's a different thing, but also you bring in musicians from different backgrounds, because I had the Met Orchestra and I had improvisers.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that was so beautiful about that piece, is that thing coming together, because they worked off each other.
Well, what's really interesting is that both have very different concepts of time.
Yeah.
I mean, time, like someone coming from the Afro diasporic back from the jazz, particularly. Sometimes we're playing the front of the beat a little bit. We're pushing.
Yeah.
And that the push pull, like push that like the Met, it's always like this.
Yeah.
It's back.
It's back, right.
Yeah, so to feel that, so to reconcile that sense of time within the orchestra. Yeah. That's fascinating to me. I mean, I could write a whole book about time.
You know what? That's exactly right. That's an incredibly, because a pitch or a time is fat. And so when I first went to Nashville, I was like, y'all are playing really late, but it wasn't late. It was just like back. And then you come to New York,
yeah, sure,
forward. It's like forward. And then it's fat, you know. And so what happened to me in the Met, when it met the improvisers, if the beat was a beautiful compromise. I'll meet you in the middle of the beat, you know.
Yeah, middle of the beat, exactly. What my friend Henry Threadgill calls the fat beat.
The fat beat.
Yeah, like he always had two drummers in his band. He had Cerrone and John Betch, and Cerrone's on top of the beat, John Betch is behind the beat. So Henry said, I had the fat beat.
The fat beat.
Said, oh, it's fat. There it is.
Yeah.
Well, would you believe it or not, this hour and a half is just like absolutely flown by. I'm sorry we did not get through all of the questions that have been in this Q&A. There's some great ones in there that I wish we could have gotten to, but just want to thank Anthony, Kamala, Jeanine, and Christopher for your time and your comments on this very important aspect of our medium in this world of magic of opera that we've all been so grateful to be a part of. And our CLDP application opens this Wednesday. So if those of you who are interested, who've been enticed by these four wonderful artists with us to try your hand at or continue your work in it, we'd love to see your application. And it has just been a great evening. And I hope to see all of you in person someday very soon. And again, thank you so much for your time.